In the winter of 1963, New York was cold in a way that settled into the bones and refused to leave. Snow gathered along the curbs in gray, uneven piles, and the city moved more slowly, more quietly, as if holding its breath. Churches stayed open late that year, their doors welcoming people who needed warmth, answers, or simply somewhere to sit without being asked to explain themselves. Her name was Eleanor Price. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and already learning how invisible a woman could become once people decided she did not fit neatly into their expectations. She worked as a secretary in a garment office near Midtown, typed invoices, answered phones, and went home to a small apartment she kept meticulously clean. She attended church every Sunday, not because she was especially devout, but because routine gave her structure, and structure kept her from thinking too much. St. Bartholomew's stood on a narrow street, its stone exterior darkened by decades of soot and weather. Inside, it smelled of old wood, wax, and something faintly metallic that Eleanor could never quite name. The pews creaked softly when people shifted their weight. Candles flickered even when there was no draft. The pastor had arrived the year before. Reverend Samuel Whitaker was younger than most people expected, tall, well-spoken, with a voice that carried easily through the sanctuary. He spoke of discipline and obedience, of temptation and responsibility. He spoke often about women's roles, though he never said anything outright cruel. It was all framed gently, wrapped in scripture, delivered with concern. People admired him. Eleanor noticed him because he noticed her. At first it was small things, a nod as she passed, a smile held a moment too long, a comment after service about her dedication, her reliability. When he asked if she would help organize church records during the week, she agreed without hesitation. It felt good to be needed. She began staying late after services, sorting papers in the small office behind the sanctuary. The church emptied slowly, footsteps echoing down the hallways until the building seemed to belong only to the two of them. Reverend Whitaker talked while she worked, his voice calm, reassuring, sometimes oddly personal. He asked about her parents, her childhood, why she had never married. She answered politely, carefully. She did not tell him about the nights she lay awake listening to the city breathe, wondering if her life had already settled into its final shape. She did not tell him how alone she felt surrounded by people. He told her she was special. He told her God placed burdens on those he trusted most. The first time he touched her, it was brief. A hand on her shoulder, a squeeze meant to comfort. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things. By the time she realized it was something, it was already too late to name it without feeling complicit. The church became quieter around her. People spoke to her less. She began to sense glances, whispers she couldn't quite hear. Reverend Whitaker's tone changed when they were alone. Sharper, more corrective. "You must guard yourself," he told her one evening. "You invite misunderstanding." She felt ashamed without knowing why. She tried to pull away, began making excuses, stopped staying late. He noticed. The sermon the following Sunday was about betrayal. Eleanor sat in the third pew, her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening as his words seemed to narrow until they pointed directly at her. She felt exposed, though no one else seemed to notice. After the service, he asked her to stay. The church emptied, the doors closed, the silence pressed in. She never came home that night. What happened inside St. Bartholomew's was never spoken aloud in full. There were no witnesses, only bruises discovered later, explanations that didn't hold, and a story shaped carefully by those who needed the church to remain untainted. Eleanor Price died on the cold stone floor beneath a sanctuary, surrounded by symbols of mercy and forgiveness that offered her neither. By morning, the city moved on, and the church opened its doors. The official explanation came quickly, wrapped in concern and certainty. Eleanor Price, they said, had suffered a fall, a tragic accident. The steps beneath the sanctuary were old, worn smooth by decades of shoes. Anyone could slip. Anyone could misstep. The bruises were consistent with impact, the doctor noted, avoiding specifics. The pastor stood beside the stretcher with his head bowed, his hands clasped, his voice trembling as he prayed aloud for her soul. People wanted to believe it. They wanted the city to make sense, for the places meant to offer refuge to remain clean and untouched. They wanted the story to end neatly, without corners that cut when examined too closely. Eleanor's sister did not believe it. Clara arrived from Queens the next morning, her coat still dusted with snow, her eyes red from a night without sleep. She had always been the louder of the two, the one who asked questions when others stayed polite. She stood in the small apartment Eleanor kept so carefully and noticed what was missing before anyone else did. The coat Eleanor always wore, the scarf she wrapped twice around her neck, the purse that never left her side. Clara asked to see the church. Reverend Whitaker met her at the door, his expression grave, his words measured. He spoke of faith and tragedy, of God's plans and human frailty. He walked her through the sanctuary slowly, explaining, pointing, pausing where he believed emotion should rise. He did not take her beneath the sanctuary. He said there was nothing to see. Clara noticed his hands. They were scraped, red, bandaged poorly. He said he had slipped earlier that morning while shoveling snow. She nodded, said nothing, and thanked him for his time. At the precinct, the detective assigned to the case was tired, overworked. He had a stack of files taller than his patience, in a city full of accidents that rarely led anywhere. He listened as Clara spoke, took notes, nodded when appropriate. When she mentioned the bruises, he shrugged gently. "Falls can look bad," he said. "Stone steps do that." "And the pastor?" Clara asked. "What about him?" "He was the last person to see her alive." The detective closed the folder. "So he says." The case stalled where most inconvenient cases stalled, in the space between suspicion and proof. Clara returned home with Eleanor's belongings packed into a single suitcase. At night, she dreamed of her sister calling her name, her voice echoing in places Clara could never reach. She began writing letters to newspapers, to church boards, to anyone who might listen. Most went unanswered. A few came back with condolences and nothing more. At St. Bartholomew's, the pew Eleanor once sat in remained empty. Reverend Whitaker continued preaching. His sermons shifted. They became heavier, more severe. He spoke often about temptation, about the danger of women who misunderstood their place. Congregants listened, some with discomfort, others with agreement. Attendance did not drop. Donations did not slow. The city, as it always did, absorbed the story and moved on. Years passed. In 1968, a young woman named Ruth joined the church choir. She was 19, recently arrived from upstate, eager to belong. Reverend Whitaker praised her voice, asked her to stay late to practice, complimented her devotion. Clara read about Ruth in the paper months later. Another fall, another accident. This time there was a witness. Another choir member who had seen Reverend Whitaker arguing with Ruth in the hallway. his face twisted with something she couldn't name at the time. This time, the bruises were harder to explain. This time, the city was changing, and people were less willing to accept silence as an answer. An investigation reopened. Old files were pulled, names re-examined. Clara was called in and asked to tell her story again. This time, someone listened. Reverend Samuel Whitaker was arrested on a gray November morning. He did not resist. He said nothing as he was led out of the church, past the stone steps, past the doors that had opened for him so many times before. Cameras flashed, people stared, some cried, some turned away. At trial, the truth came out slowly, painfully, in pieces. The private meetings, the control, the anger when obedience turned into independence, the violence framed as correction, faith used as a weapon. Eleanor Price's name was spoken aloud in court for the first time in years. The verdict did not bring her back, but it changed the story. St. Bartholomew's closed its doors shortly after. The building stood empty for years, its windows dark, its pews gathering dust. Eventually it was sold, renovated, turned into apartments. The stone beneath the sanctuary was sealed beneath concrete, the past buried but not erased. Clara kept Eleanor's notebook on her bedside table. She read it sometimes, tracing her sister's careful handwriting, listening for her voice in the quiet moments before sleep. In the city that never stopped moving, Eleanor Price was remembered by those who chose not to look away. And sometimes late at night, when the wind moved just right through the narrow street where the church once stood, it almost sounded like footsteps echoing, steady, unafraid, finally walking out into the open air.